Okay, so I'm going to now officially mute everybody, except for Steve and myself. Let's see if I can find Steve on the list here. Iris Scott is here. Wow, and Goshen. Nancy Dyer's here. Hi, Nancy. Nancy Hillsworth is here. Where's Steve? There he is. Okay, unmute Steve. Unmute Steve. It's not unmuting for some reason. I don't know why.
Hi, am I unmuted now?
Oh yeah, there you are.
Hello, everyone.
Hello, Steve. So I'm going to pin your video, and folks, if you see like all the different squares, I'm going to pin his video, so it might change on your screen or it might not. But you can always, if you don't know Zoom very well, you can. There's a little box on the top where you can, it's a little checkerboard square thing. You can click on that and get everybody, or you can pin a particular video if you want to see that one big. So anyway, that's what we're going to do. So the format of today's meeting will go something like this. We'll start with Steve doing a presentation, and we'll do about 30 minutes or so, 40 minutes perhaps, of his presentation, and then we'll do some question and answering. He will do question and answering, and then he'll guide us through a meditation, sort of a havening meditation, specifically, I believe, for the current situation that we are all facing, the COVID-19 situation, and how we can best self-care for that using havening. And then again, we'll just open it up to the sort of chit chat. I might figure out to put you in groups to do that more organized instead of 50 people trying to talk at once. Maybe I'll put you in groups of 5 or something. We can just sort of get to know the community a little bit. And then I'll put you into groups of 2, breakout groups of 2. So you can actually do havening with each other. This is in fact a practice group. So we're going to see if we can practice. If at that time you decide you don't want to stick around for that, let us know and you can say goodbye. But the people who do want to stick around, it's really a nice thing. It's really a nice thing to be able to, share with what we have, this beautiful, amazing gift that we have of havening, to share it with each other and to get havened. We need it. So it's a very nice thing to do this. And by the way, it's also a really nice thing to reach out to fellow haveners. You can do that on the Facebook group or other situations. I had a really great session just a couple of days ago with Kim Sun, as an example. Kim is, as many of you know, is a havening trainer who also teaches midwifery and work with women in that situation. And as you can well imagine, many women right now in the New York City area are opting out of having their deliveries in the hospital. So midwives are in huge demand, and she and her people are being run ragged. So really good to support the folks that need supporting as well. The caregivers who caregive need care for themselves. So with that, I will turn it over to Steve Ruden. Thank you very much, everyone, and thank you, Steve, for being here.
Well, thank you, Doug, for having me. I'd like can everybody see me? Or it looks like I'm looking at you, Doug.
Well, the recording is on my computer. So what I see is you in big screen. And so I don't know what you see, but you can.
I see you in big screen. Okay. So I want to be able to throw up my PowerPoint.
Yeah.
So I need to share my screen.
Yeah, share your screen. Can you do that?
I think I can do that and share.
There you go. You got it. You're doing it.
And let me see if I can find my PowerPoint. Oops. This is not exactly the slide I want to be, but we'll get back to that. Go back up here. Can everybody see the slides?
They're all muted, so we'll have to assume they can. I can see them. If you, by the way, folks, there is a chat option. I don't know if you can see that in your little controls at the bottom of your screen or somewhere in the screen, but there's a little chat option. So you can write in, you can type in questions, you can type in comments, and you could type in right now things like, yes, I can see it, or no, I can't see it, things like that.
Are we ready to go?
Yeah, All set.
Well, for those of you who have never met me, how are you? For those of you who know me already, good to see you. And I'd just like to make just a few quick comments before I start. First of all, I want to do a little shout out for our conference in June online. It's going to be a remarkable event. And I think that this is a once in a lifetime opportunity to go to 2 annual conferences for the price of one. So I'd like you all just to seriously consider that. The second thing is as I just want to reiterate what Doug had said, was I'm going to post online something about buddying up and just allow that thread to run for people who would like to buddy up with someone if they're home alone or if they're unable to go out. This community, which is just amazing, should be able to just chime in and extend a helping hand for all those people. I'd like to thank, just so you know, all my fabulous trainers and all of you practitioners and students that have made this community so vibrant. And hopefully over the next few years, we'll be able to help the world be a little bit more safer and more comfortable. So thank you all. So every year I get the challenge of trying to come up with a topic for the annual conference. So this year I decided to tackle the concept of consciousness and thalamus and brain glue, the glial cells. So in my spare time, I read quite a number of articles that I find interesting. Doug, did you remove all the pictures of all the people, by the way?
Yes.
Can you put them back on? Because I'd like to ask some just raise your hand questions. Is that possible?
Well, you're sharing your screen, so I'm not sure that we can do that, but I can try. I can see if I can do that.
If not, we could just go.
Have you stopped sharing your screen?
No.
Okay, so
So
that's as big as I can get it.
Okay, so how many of you out there have actually felt an alteration in your consciousness? How many of you have felt time distortion? How many of you, if you watch a television program and you see people at a wedding recoil in horror that they're all together? And these things are what impacts our conscious mind. How does that work? I mean, how does one day seeing something like someone at a wedding or a party look really great and wonderful, and the next day it looks like it's something that you would not really ever consider? So my work that I've looked at this, and we're going to have a little touch of what I'm going to talk about in June, is what is the biological function of consciousness? Not how consciousness works. My view of this after doing this research is probably no one can ever really know how consciousness works because it's ridiculously complex. But we have such a problem in definition of what is consciousness. So what I'd like to do today is explore what I have found to help define consciousness so you can have a point of view that has a definition. Now, this article I spent most of my time with, let me bring it up. This article by Brian Earl.
Steve, let me just stop you for a second. We're not seeing your slides.
Okay.
So you need to just share your screen again if you can do that.
Stop share. Okay.
I still see them, Doug.
You do?
I do.
I just see Steve.
It's your gallery, so you squeeze it in.
I see it too.
I see them all.
Okay.
Before.
All right.
Now they're gone.
Now they're gone.
Okay, try it one more time, Steve. Share your screen one time. I think maybe I just goofed up on my end. But I need to see them here because this is the recording. So I need to figure out what I'm doing wrong. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Okay, we're seeing him now. Good.
Can
Okay,
we-
go ahead.
Can
Carry
we
on.
move we have the list right in the middle of my screen, Doug. Can you move
Yes.
that? Thank you.
Oh, yeah,
Did you move it?
I think so.
All right. It looks like it's right in the middle of my screen.
Which list is that?
The list of the people who are watching.
In my screen, it's up in the little corner. I don't see that list.
Okay, well.
You can just drag the list to the side.
Yeah, I'll just minimize it and drag it. Oops. Anyway, I hope everybody can see this. We'll go as best as we can. This article was written a few years ago, actually in August of 2014. And when I came across it and read it, I spent quite a bit of time because it was a very interesting article, which I'm going to share some of the points with. Not the whole presentation, but just some salient ideas that came out of this brilliant paper. So if you want, you could take this guy's name down, Brian Earl, The Frontiers of Psychology, The Biological Function of Consciousness. You can Google it, it'll bring it up. It is a free article, so you can all have this. Okay, so we've all seen this picture, but I want to just give some historical data to this picture. So we as humans or mammals believe that our brains and brains of our predecessors hundreds of millions of years ago really look like this. But its fact is that if you look at the green area where you have the mammillary body, the pons, the medulla, the spinal cord, most early organisms didn't need much information to survive. In fact, visual addition, the addition of vision is a very late comer to the world of sensory input. So are our other inputs. So one could ask the question, does bacteria have a consciousness? Well, the answer is, from this definition, probably yes, because it can respond to a threat. And just to give an example, if you were a bacteria and we threw in an antibiotic, you would either die from the predator, the antibiotic, or you would change and adapt. Like we see how bacteria have adapted to our antibiotics today. And this requires a very sophisticated set of understandings to change your RNA to deal with that threat. So if we can view that even a simple bacteria can have a consciousness such that it can sense a predator and then adapt, maybe we could begin to understand that consciousness exists throughout the whole spectrum of life. And what we have, which is what you see on the screen so far, is the end result of a specific type of development that suits human behavior. So as we look at this just quickly, if we look about halfway down from maybe from the third ventricle down, most of those things belong to the autonomic nervous system. They allow you to breathe. They allow your heart to go. They cause you to blink. They modulate your blood pressure. They do your digestion. They tell you when to have sex or eat or have food or any of those other things. Totally not involved in conscious control. And for the most part, animals, really, that's all they needed. And then all of a sudden, more evolved needs became. So we needed, as we evolved, we needed to be able to make decisions, see things differently. So if I was an earthworm, for example, I would not need any more consciousness than the ability for me to differentiate between light and dark. So it would tell me if I'm on the surface or if I'm under the surface. It may even tell me as an earthworm how deep in the surface I am. But my needs as far as consciousness goes were very, very little. And as we grew into more sophisticated organisms, the needs for consciousness became more evident for us to be able to make better behavioral choices. So what my thought is with this slide is to understand that we didn't come this way. This evolved over billions of years as the needs of our organism increased in complexity. So, here we have a person taking a shot at a target. If, for example, we see the target and we use our consciousness, our visual cortex, to integrate our muscles and how much pull back we need to do and how much strength we need in our arms and how much tension we need in the bow to project this arrow onto that target, that sensory input is then filtered through our system to give us the appropriate response to create the task. Well, what happens if we don't have that? What happens if that's not there? How do we know how hard to pull the bow? How do we know where to aim? How do we know how much tension we need to place on our muscles or balance this? We can't. So the understanding is this, that consciousness at its root is only sensory input. Let me repeat that and we'll discuss this a little bit further as we go through the program. Consciousness as we know it is fundamentally sensory input. This is interesting. I would suspect that most of you have heard the phrase, we only use 10% of our brain. Now, there's a story behind that. So when I went to do this talk, I went to look up that because I couldn't find the origin of that. And the origin of that is very simple. William James, who was an early 20th century philosopher, was hanging out with a gentleman who was a genius. And he compared himself to this genius, and he kind of determined that we only use a small percentage of our brain. And because this genius was so brilliant that he said, well, he must be using more of his brain. And then along came this guy, this fellow who was able to develop a stain called Golgi. Dr. Golgi came along and he made a stain called the Golgi stain, and it stained neurons. And so therefore, most of the discussion and exploration and development of ideas was involved in understanding how neurons worked. However, imagine that nature would never, ever, ever be so inefficient as to have the brain occupied 90% of it to do nothing. So many of the early thinkers in understanding the mind and the brain and how this works really kind of ignored 90% of the material in the brain. And they went down this neuronal concept of how things work, which became a little bit problematical in developing the ideas of what consciousness is. So, is it interesting to consider whether consciousness, and I'm going to define this, my ongoing experience, what's happening to me in front of me right this moment in actual milliseconds, even though we can't perceive milliseconds, this is what's happening in milliseconds in our brain that's being processed. And does this influence one's behavior? Now, let's go to the next slide. Consciousness, as in the sense of phenomenal consciousness, one's ongoing experience, ultimately prioritizing of sensory input and thought for task relevant, which is done non-consciously. So what we're really doing when we're conscious, we're prioritizing whatever sensory input is coming into us and for task relevance, and that is why we experience feelings. And this is done non-consciously. As we all recognize now, we're having an alteration in our consciousness. And when you have things that are self-important, important to ourselves and our survival, our consciousness alters. So now we're aware of whether we're close to someone, where I'm putting my hands. I'm aware of that there's some unknown predator that we can't see, touch, or feel is in our consciousness, and that changes our behavior. Almost everything we do now is based on the understanding that we have an unseeable threat. And we view with our sensory input, our taste, our smell, or hearing, or eyesight, and our taste, anyway, the five senses, and one other, thought, and its issue. And that should be also considered the sixth sense. So, what are the functions of consciousness? Well, they take in as sensory input or thought specific sensory input which are task relevant. So the concept of multitasking is really a misnomer. Your sensory input can only focus on one particular task at a time. So if you want to just test that out, you could all try to count backwards from 100 by threes and hum Happy Birthday. Very difficult to do. And here's where I'm going to try to give some definition for us understanding consciousness and unconsciousness and things like that. I'm taking out the concepts of unconscious and subconscious. These are very challenging words for me to explain. So I'm just going to call it non-consciousness, that which is not sensory input. So for the most part, or 90% of us, we're really doing everything non-consciously. Our heart rate, our blood pressure, or anything that is going on, 90% of it is done by those much earlier neural structures that in our evolved experience, we do no longer have to pay attention to, except if it's threatened. So loss of oxygen, certainly, we would certainly set off alarms in our mind. And the third type of consciousness is access consciousness. Now, access consciousness is additive to non-consciousness. Experiences and knowledge that are generally stored in the hippocampus and cerebral cortex. So we have these three elements that are involved in our behavioral decisions. So access consciousness is available for reasoning and direct conscious control of action and speech, thoughts, beliefs, emotions. You know, it's funny, well, not funny, it's true that you recognize consciously an emotion after that emotion is present. You can consciously recognize the emotion before it is present. Many people think I feel sad is the beginning. Actually, that's the end result of a conscious process that then allows it to be expressed.
Steve, I'm just going to pause for one moment and ask you everyone to mute themselves if they haven't already. I've tried to mute everyone. I'm going to do it again. And then I'll unmute Steve one more time.
Can you hear me?
Yes, you should be good to go.
Great. So,
Steve, do you have a dog barking in the background?
Yeah, it's outside.
Oh, that's you. Okay. All right. Never mind. Then continue, please.
So we have thoughts, which we can recall. And what's interesting, we actually have developed two thought systems. We have a declarative thought system that in which we can recall events. And then we have a felt sense system, a non-declarative thing which we would normally call the felt sense. So if we look at that as an adaptation to help ourselves make better choices, our thoughts therefore have become not only more complex in their nature, but they become recallable for additional use, and they add on to our knowledge as we continue. So, and we have beliefs. And these beliefs are things that are built over time through our experiences. Sometimes, and whatever the beliefs are, you build up a storehouse of these beliefs that you consider to be foundationally correct for you. And then when you go out into the world, your consciousness uses a prism to filter in information so that whether or not your beliefs and your thoughts are in alignment so that you can continue to move forward. And then emotions. Emotions come from the Latin word removere, means to move out. But at the end of the day, the emotions are the representation of the non-conscious workings of our mind to say, I feel sad, and then have the thoughts and belief systems that are associated with that. Here's another thing. about consciousness and non-consciousness. Access consciousness has no conscious awareness to its activity or process. If you want to go back and go, how much is 2 plus 2? You have no conscious awareness of how you arrived at 4, what that process was. And in addition, if you go 2 plus 2 equals 5, you also intrinsically know, without understanding the process, that that is an incorrect answer in our way of thinking about numbers. So access consciousness is a non-conscious activity. Thus, access conscious is non-conscious. We want to move away from subconscious or unconscious thinking. We are not aware of the processes that create behavior and expression. I threw this slide in because, first of all, I loved it. It's a banyan tree. And nature duplicates itself in so many ways. It's figured out certain aspects of itself and just duplicates it all over the place. So if we look at this banyan tree and we look at the green area as our cerebral cortex and the trunk of the tree as our thalamus, sending afferent information to the cerebral cortex, and the downward branches of this tree then go back to feed other information and then send information to the rest of our organism, we can see a totally metaphorical situation of how our brain works. Information in through the thalamus, through the cerebral cortex, modulated by, which we'll talk about, something else, and then we have feedback down both through the thalamus and through secondary information centers that send out afferent information to allow us to function. I hope everyone gets that slide. So this is interesting. Analysis of the components of consciousness, structure of consciousness, and temporal sequence, how these things occur in time, has established a, contrary to one's intuitive understanding, consciousness does not have an active and executive role in determining behavior. Well, for most people, I think that's a pretty big thing to swallow, because in your understanding of psychotherapeutics, it's all about consciousness. Being consciously aware of something, bringing it to consciousness, thinking about it, going to declarative memories, talking about felt memories. But contrary to one's intuitive understanding, consciousness does not have an active and executive role in determining behavior. Let me go get my notes here. So let's go to the next slide. Consciousness does, though, have a biological function. Well, that's good to know. And it's going to help us define how we view consciousness. So at the end of the day, Brian Earl said that consciousness is associated with a flexible response mechanism, an FRM. So let's go see. So the flexible response mechanism is used for decision-making, planning, and generally responding in non-automatic ways. And the flexible response mechanism generates responses by manipulating information, and to function effectively, its data input must be restricted to task-relevant information. Now, how does it do that? How does consciousness, which has no executive function whatsoever, therefore then select appropriate information for task-relevant activities? And the answer is, it does it through the thalamus, which is connected in multiple ways to the limbic system and the cerebral cortex and the autonomic nervous system. There are interwoven connections to all of this. So I'd like you to understand, like the picture of the tree, that consciousness now, sensory input to the thalamus selects this information. Let me see if you could, I have some diagrams here, but it's gonna be a little dicey to put it up and go back and forth. But imagine that sensory input to the thalamus, which is then selects those data which you need for task relevant information, such as that girl who was the archer. So she needed to be able to function to do her craft. She needed task relevant information and the removal of non-relevant information so the system can run efficiently. So if we have too much information coming in, therefore we're not able to utilize it efficiently, and that may be, to the end of the day, to our demise, whether it be we don't get away from the predator quick enough, or we eat something that we know is poisonous, or whatever the case may be. So we have to define ourselves in task-relevant information. Now, being an older person, sometimes I have a task and I go up to my room and I don't remember what my task was. So I have to almost go back to where I started to recall what the task was, and then go upstairs and complete that task. This is what happens, guys, when you get older. So there are three aspects of what I'm going to discuss in June that will be of interest. And they are, one, what is the evidence that one experiences no mental processes in anything we do? No mental processes. Two, that consciousness is adaptive. It is adaptive, and just like you have seen that your consciousness has been altered, it is adaptive to the circumstances that we are in. So the thalamus at that point, will choose that task-relevant information and adapt the responses in the flexible response mechanism to give the most relevant outcomes. And three, consciousness is solely information, data. Now, this is interesting. The properties of consciousness correspond to various input requirements of the flexible response mechanism. And when information is missing or corrupt, the function of the flexible response mechanism is disrupted. There's a very important point here. And that point is that consciousness and the conscious neural structures had to evolve simultaneously and had to be adaptive to the needs of the organism to improve its chances of survival. Okay, so we have those three fundamental ideas which we're going to chat about. And I'll repeat them. Evidence that consciousness is adaptive, evidence that one experiences no mental processes, and evidence that consciousness is solely information. Thus, consciousness is the input data for the flexible response mechanism. That's it. That's all that it is. And everything that happens when you have sensory input, just like this is such a wonderful time to explain consciousness, because all of you have altered consciousness from where you were 3 weeks ago. So you can appreciate that our input to the flexible response mechanism is now different than it was 3 weeks ago. Now, this is a very interesting concept I'm going to talk about now. Qualitative and quantitative information, what our senses see, feel, hear, touch, see, are incorporated into the input by a qualia array, and I'm going to discuss qualia array in a second, of colors, shapes, and sounds, and so on, which makes the input conscious. It has meaning. I would recommend you go look up qualia array. It is a very challenging concept to understand. It took me quite a while. And what it is that these aspects at our level of consciousness are important for our flexible response mechanism to work properly. We have such sophisticated differentiation. So, if I was a Neanderthal, I needed a vocabulary that was not so nuanced as it is today. Maybe a word for hammer or lion or wife or child. But we're not talking in terms of nuance as the feeling of velvet and the color of purple, or the sense of Mozart, or these things. We did not necessarily need those qualitative and quantitative information because they weren't relevant to our survival. So understand that qualia and qualia array are a very, 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 very recent presentation to our conscious data. And that conscious data helps us make decisions in a different way. So if you see a poisonous snake, and you could tell by its colors and how it moves, these are things that have been gleaned over years of understanding. And and people have deficiencies in these things. So there are people who are red-green colorblind. And so if those people who are red-green colorblind, that corrupts the information going into the flexible response mechanism. And a lot of animals and a lot of organisms are totally achromatic. They just see white dark. And therefore, we may see lack of polychromia, where we see lack of multicolors, but it's very rare we lose light and dark, because that is such a primitive function that goes well below our interpretation of the cerebral cortex. So qualia is just something that we have as differentiators, as things that we can now work with. And okay, so imagine that we are looking at a strawberry. And we know strawberries pretty well. And you could take a tiny little close-up of strawberry and see that little yellow-orange seed on that strawberry, and then the red sounding it. And through declarative memory, you could then infer that that is a strawberry, because the qualia of that strawberry informs us, because it has made us conscious of what that is. I hope you have a lot of questions later. Therefore, consciousness can only have a biological value as input to a mechanism or mechanisms that determine behavior. So the evolution of conscious neural structures did not involve changes to the outside of the nervous system that confer physical advantages such as improved camouflage, quicker movements, or improved organ function. Therefore, if consciousness is adaptive, its biological value must result from allowing improved behavioral choices for its possessors. Hence, consciousness can only have adaptive value by virtue of its being able to influence behavior. Now, here's something interesting. If everybody would put their hand on the table and look at your hand and pick a finger, there was no conscious act done in you picking a finger. It came to conscious awareness when you eventually picked your finger, and that non-conscious activity, actually, they can test this, started approximately at 150 milliseconds. But conscious awareness occurs at about 350 milliseconds. So we are aware of the choosing of the finger after we've already chose the finger non-consciously. Now pick one finger and move it. Boop. There was no conscious activity that allowed you to move that finger. And all the selection of all the muscles, of all the responses, lifting a finger is not just a simple fact. It requires an enormous amount of muscular coordination just to move that simple little finger. And then what's interesting, our consciousness in real active time, our sensory input, actually in real time informs us of our behavior. So if I'm reaching for a glass, for example, and that glass moves for some reason, my brain, before I can become consciously aware of it, already adjusts that behavior so I can grab that glass. Therefore, consciousness increases the adaptability of behavior and thus survival. Consciousness can only have a biologic value if it benefits the organism by changing its behavior. This next slide is interesting. A thought. If that is correct, then different species have different consciousnesses to reflect their environment and biological needs. No activity of mind is conscious. Too bad, that's just what it is. Miller says that thinking is a pre-conscious process. I think, therefore I am, I think. So I'm gonna just unshare my screen, and just if there are people who have any questions about this, I'll be more than happy to take it. And then I have a little bit more presentation for about 15 more minutes. Is that okay, Doug?
Yeah, that's fine by me.
Good. I'm going to unshare.
And I will unmute all. You are now unmuted, everyone, so behave.
So, does anyone have any?
There's a lot of noise. It says it unmute all, but
You know what? If you could go down and write them in the chat area. Did you write? If you have questions, write them in the chat area.
Hi, Scott. So I'm going to mute everybody. Quick, mute everybody, and You have an ability to raise your hand. I'm not sure exactly how that works, but it's somewhere in this little thing box. You can raise your hand, and I can then unmute you, and so that you can ask your question. Let me just go back up to the top of this list here, and unmute Steve. Now he's not at the top of the list. Yeah. Okay, so go down to alphabetical, unmute Steve. So Steve, you are now unmuted. So yes, type in a question in the chat, and then I will unmute you. And so, sorry.
Cornelia Kaufman, creativity is non-conscious.
Okay, I'll find Cornelia Kaufman. See if it's alphabetical. All right, Cornelia, you've got two Cornelias.
Yes,
Cornelia Kaufman, creativity.
one is my phone and the
Okay.
other one is my computer.
Okay, well, you're talking, so go ahead. What's your question?
Yes, the question about creativity, if the unconscious is basically just a flexible response mechanism,
If
where does
consciousness,
creativity comes in?
creativity, there we have no awareness as to how creativity is formed. So it is a non-conscious event.
Okay,
When
thanks.
the flexible response mechanism manipulates the information, you may form an intent, which we'll talk about in a second, but then the flexible response mechanism manipulates all the information, your thoughts, your emotions, your feelings, your senses, to come up with a solution to your intent. And so, Cornelia, are you an artist?
No?
Okay. And so, when you're talking about creativity, what would you like? How would you like me to? So, if I'm and my wife's an artist, I'm not. So, they have no conscious awareness when they're putting the stroke on the canvas of any conscious activity to allow them to apply that stroke. It is only after the stroke is applied do they become consciously aware of what has happened, which is then
Okay.
a feedback, which is then consciously a feedback to the non-conscious mechanism of the flexible response mechanism. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Wonderful.
Okay, so Steve, you pick another question from the comment section, and I'll unmute them.
Do we inherit our level of consciousness?
Who's asking?
The answer is not only do we have ancestral consciousness, that's correct, we have epigenetic consciousness, which occurs after we're born. So all of our experiences, which are left and placed in our cerebral cortex as thoughts, emotions, and beliefs, are part of our consciousness interpretive system, which is regulated by the thalamus. And, which is really interesting, I'm glad you brought up this question, is then not only are we ancestral in nature, which I'll talk about probably at another time, but from a epigenetic standpoint, my grandchildren's consciousnesses are going to be permanently affected by the circumstances that they are in right now. My granddaughter is sleeping under her bed sometimes. And so what happens is, which I'll talk about, something else happens, which I'll explain in the next series of slides, that involve the neural tube and the basal ganglia and other very primitive systems that cause our consciousness to be a certain way. And, you know, I think we could all recognize in many ways that we're very much like our parents. Because our parents' consciousness came from their parents and their great-grandparents and down that lineage. And that's how we survive today, by their knowledge that they were able to get long enough to be able to procreate and have you. So they then transfer all that information, all that skill sets, whether you're an athlete and you transfer those epigenetically, or a scientist or an artist or a doc or whatever. These things are then transmitted over millennium. So in many ways, we are who our ancestors were. That's how we got here. Paula, when you talk, Paula Emerton, what is your question?
Paula, you can unmute yourself, perhaps.
Is he here?
Is that it?
Paula?
Can you hear me?
There she
Hi,
is. Yeah.
Paula.
Can you hear
What-
me?
I can.
Yes.
What's your
Yeah.
question?
So basically, it seems like with the social distancing, like when I go out in London, there's not a lot of people around, but it's like the whole world has been programmed to keep away from each other. So, and also, like you said, that was one of the things. I can't imagine, you know, it will go back to normal at some point.
It will be a new normal.
Yeah, so this will be the new normal. So,
My view of is that there are, depending upon the vulnerability of the individual, their landscape, they will either develop new normals or build resilience to these things. And there will be some subsets of maybe teenagers or my grandchildren that will carry this forward. So there's going to be a new normal that may take generations ultimately. We're in a 1 in 100 year century problem here. So there will be a lot of unbundling and a lot of forgetting and a lot of things, when you look at these things, they usually, we still have people who are children of Holocaust survivors, or children of the Great Depression, which still have some of these things that were brought forward genetically and epigenetically for our survival. Does that answer your question?
yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Kishana. Kishana, are you there?
You can unmute yourself, Kishana.
Kia ora from New Zealand. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
I'm not sure if that was relevant to consciousness. It was just my trying to grapple and understand the flexible response mechanism, because it appears that we are only able to be accessing the resources that are available at the time in this moment, and the level of stress upon the system downregulates the FRM in some way. So I guess I'm trying to understand that, although possibly not making as much sense.
Well, I'll talk about that in a minute. There are things that happen in our understand that the complexity of our responses are to a level that is unfathomable. Billions of operations are going on all simultaneously, even for the simple aspect of forming a word. The movement of your lips and tongue and airway and function requires such complex muscle contractions and expansion and diaphragmatic issues, a whole wide variety of things that we have no access to that. But I'm going to give some insight in the next 5 or 6 slides to how this kind of coalesces together.
And it brings to mind, Stephen, the collective unconscious, or the idea that our consciousness is not individual, but possibly that we are the sum of the total.
I believe that I believe that's probably true. And we actually, if you look at it, there are actually, I wrote this, if you go back to, I think, 18, I wrote a list of about 20 consciousnesses. So there's the collective consciousness, there's the community consciousness, there's a species consciousness, there's a family consciousness, there's an individual consciousness. All of these consciousnesses that involve our relationship to the world, or to our neighbor, to our family, to ourselves, all have input into the flexible response mechanism that determines our behavior. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and far more. Thank you so much for all you're offering to us today.
Thank you.
Steve, do you want to take another question before you finish your slide?
We'll take one more question, and I'll just repeat this. So, Ellen, you asked, would you ask me your question, please? There are a lot of great questions here, but I think I'm just going to leave.
Sorry, now can you hear me? Yeah.
So,
After what I was asking, what is conscious when you have hypnagogic hallucinations during sleep, and you're actually controlling your the action there. So you stop them or you go out of it?
well, at the end of the day, you're only non-conscious. You're non-conscious only during third stage slow wave sleep, when at that time you go into atonia.
Yeah.
Because consciousness is thoughts, and dreams are thoughts, and mind wandering is thoughts, and daydreaming are thoughts. Those are all part of consciousness that feeds into, remember, it's 6 senses, not 5, 6 senses. So consciousness, so thought, emotions, and belief are equally validated as a sense to the mind as are other senses.
Thank you. You just confirmed what I wanted to, if I've understood you right.
So it's in alignment with your belief systems.
Yes, okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else? One more question? You have such great questions here. Roger. Roger, go to your question.
Right, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Roger.
Yeah, well, I just thought, well, if everything we do is actually unconscious, how does that affect moral judgments of the things that we do? You know, people think, oh, well, someone's a mugger, therefore they're a bad person, but actually they're just doing it all unconsciously. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts are that we have underlying, what it is, we have underlying experiences that cause the prism of our responsiveness. So if a child is sexually abused during childhood, for example, their consciousness or their prism of how they view things is different than a child that's been nurtured. So they actually see the world different. But their responses in society, therefore, are non-conscious based on that epigenetic determination that occurred during early childhood. But their responses are non-conscious.
Yeah.
I don't know if that, and the key, one of the keys here, I think, is to think about consciousness and non-consciousness, not subconscious and not subconscious and
unconscious.
Unconscious. It's muddy. It gets muddy. So think about consciousness and non-consciousness as the two, and access consciousness as the 3 forms of consciousness. And then when you leave here today, you'll begin to see how your consciousness affects everything you do. And also understand that consciousness is only a partial representation of what your experience is. So since your consciousness is task relevant, much of the peripheral information that's coming in does not reach conscious awareness. So you're really getting a very incomplete representation of the moment that you're in, only to the extent, just like that archer was conscious. She didn't see the stands of people screaming. She didn't see the other things. She was able to focus on that task. So it's important, I think, to understand that consciousness is task relevant and that we only see a partial representation of the experience that we're having.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're all ready to go on to the next few slides.
That
works for everybody, and then we'll have another quick Q&A. How's that? Good?
Perfect.
15 minutes.
Okay.
For these questions. Do I feel to watch something?
If you want to, just write the questions.
Please, everyone, mute yourself.
May, just mute yourself, May. Thank you. So I'm going to share a screen now. Share screen. Nope. Cancel. So share. Share. Okay. Okay. So this is so much fun to think about. You know, for me, you know, this is what I do with my life. This is what I do with my spare time. And certainly all of us are super busy. So this is play for me. These are my distractions and how I learn and grow and become whatever it is I want to learn. So this is a wonderful picture of glia. And in the last 20, 25 years, the neuroscientists have been taking a really good look at the 90% of the brain we, quote, don't use. And what you're looking at in this picture are astrocytes, and they're actually attached to a blood vessel. I don't know the exact stain they're using here to produce it, but we're going to talk about how glia affect what we do and how it is interconnected to the neuronal system, the flexible response mechanism, and the thalamus, which helps create behavior. Really, a lot of it to begin to share the understanding of complexity. How what may seem to be one way is certainly far more complex than we may imagine. So glia, which are a specific type of cell, they're derived, most of them, the macroglia, which we'll talk about on the right-hand side in a moment, are derived from ectoderm. Ectoderm comes from the neural tube, and it is one of the 3 primordial tissues that give us everything we have. Just for your information, we have ectoderm, endoderm, and mesoderm. And these are the 3 primordial tissues that everything that we have in our body is made of. And what's interesting is being a dentist is tooth structure is the only structure in the whole mouth that is made from all 3 primordial tissues. That's pretty cool. I make holes in it all the time, but that's what I do. So we have in the macroglia, when they were looking at this stuff, they found 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 types of glia. Now this is in the central nervous system. I'm going to only talk mostly about what's in the brain, but I will briefly mention 2 other cells that occur that are macroglia, but they're in the peripheral nervous system and they do different functions. I'll just briefly mention them. So we have astrocytes, and that's that green guy there. And you can see he's fairly large, and he has quite a bit of connection to quite a bit of things. These are oleodendrocytes, these blue guys. These are all macroglia. And this occupies 90% of the brain, these guys. And up on top here, we have ependymal cells. And on the outside of the ependymal cells is the cerebral spinal fluid. So we'll talk about these type of cells in a minute and what they do and how they relate to what we're talking about. Now, Schwann cells, which I didn't bring up on the slides, or satellite cells, are cells that are in the peripheral nervous system and actually function somewhat similar to the astrocytes, oleodendrocytes, and ependymal cells. And another cell that I'm going to talk about is the microglia. And, you know, glia means glue, brain glue. And when they were looking at these cells originally, microcytes are burnt umber, orange, these brownish things, and they have very specific functions. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to explain the functions of these different type of glia, and then connect them back to consciousness and the thalamus. So you'll have an understanding of the complexity of this all. So look how magnificent a glial astrocyte is. How many billions of years do you think nature took to create this amazing cell? It's beautiful. It's really a work of art that nature created. And astrocytes are called star cells, from the astro meaning star. They have a body called the soma, which is that little eye you're looking at in the middle. That's the soma, and there's a nucleus in there. And it has multiple projections that connect to many neurons. The end processes that you see here are called end feet. We're going to talk about that in a second. Astrocytes, these beautiful cells, are the most numerous of the glial cells. They are the workhorse of the glial system, and they have multiple functions. So let's take a look at that for a moment. So this is a diagram of an astrocyte. So you'll see the nucleus and the big body there. That's called the soma of the astrocyte. And these astrocytes are highly, highly, highly branched. Hundreds and hundreds of branches, and they connect to thousands. Each astrocyte connects to thousands of cells, thousands. And I think the ratio of neurons to glial cells is 10 to 1 in our human brain. 10 glial cells to each neuron. So each neuron's getting a lot of information from these glial cells. So what we see here is the functions of the glial cells. First, they create physical scaffolding for the underlying neuronal network. So you can see that the end feet are like arms, and they hold on neurons, which are those things that are covered by the myelin and the axon. Those are neurons in our nervous system. So the astrocytes, by the way, which are motile and communicate to the neurons by calcium waves, by modulating calcium in the interstitial tissue. That means the tissue in between cells, create changes in the cells, create changes in the neurons, and creates changes in the interstitial ions. So the potassium and the sodium and the calcium are all modulated by the astrocyte, which will either intake these ions or produce more ions, and actually works at the level of the cell membrane. If you remember, part of the science that we talk about is that when you depotentiate an AMPAR receptor, it requires a concentration of calcium ions outside the cell that is gated by the NMDR cells, which depolarize and then opens up calcium voltage dependent channels, which then allows calcium to go into the system as secondary messengers to create the changes we need. I know that's a mouthful, but read the primer. They occupy space, and they help spatial relationships. They respond to injury. Now, this is so interesting. Let's say you have a damage in your brain. You get a stab wound or something else causes damage, an infarct, a brain infarct where you have cell death due to capillary freeze or something like that. The astrocytes then all migrate all over to the area of the injury and form a glial scar around it to wall it off. So one of the properties of astrocytes is to protect the surrounding tissues by placing a scar around it to encapsulate the dead or non-functioning material from proliferating outward. As I said, they maintain homeostasis of the interstitial fluid. They balance particularly calcium and potassium, and they really regulate, for the most part, what's going on. So what's interesting about that, and I think someone was asking that, we can hypothesize that astrocytes create mood. Now, mood is different than feelings because it is an overarching sense of a feeling that one carries with them. So if you are sad, that's a mood. If you are angry, that is a mood. And these things can persist or be activated by a whole wide variety of things, but it's more of an overarching sense rather than a particular sense that, and this creates different presentations. The astrocytes then create different presentations to the neurons and the axons and things like that. So I hope everybody's getting it. I know it's a little complicated. The astrocyte also releases lactate to neurons. So if there's an injury, for example, or they're not able to get sufficient glucose and oxygen, then that's what they need to form ATP and allow their action potential to go through the neuron. The astrocytes offer a secondary source of nutrition to the neurons at that time. You also see that the astrocyte sits on a blood vessel. And these are very important aspects of it. And they have end feet that go over there, and they create quite a tight seal and modulate what molecules can come in and out of these capillaries in the brain. So they form something called the blood-brain barrier. So if you remember those end feet from the previous slide here, you can see them wrapping themselves around the blood vessel, these little tiny capillaries where one or two blood cells flow through, and they modulate not only the ions that are moved out of that cell or back into the cell, but they also modulate how the interstitial tissue is working. So this is a really important function of the astrocyte. And this is something that is really a game changer in your understanding about how we do things. So I'll try to explain this to you in a way that you'll understand. So we see here a presynaptic terminal and a postsynaptic terminal. Now, what would happen if at the postsynaptic terminal, so the object is, in synapses, is to continually stimulate the postsynaptic membrane to receive impulses that create one of two actions. A, it causes muscle movement, or B, it causes the glands to become active in our body. Really, it's really that simple. Glands or muscles, that's it. So what happens is now, if the space in between is called the synaptic cleft, what would happen if it was only glutamate there and there was no way to clear that synapse for another action potential to come by? So the synapse, therefore, would always be turned on. So how does then that synapse get cleared, getting ready for the next action potential to tell it what it does? It does it by the astrocytes. So imagine if you took your hands and wrapped them around 360 degrees around the postsynaptic terminal, the presynaptic membrane terminal, and in between the synaptic cleft. And the end feet go all around that synaptic cleft, and they clear GABA, and glutamate after the action potential is passed to reset that synapse for the next action potential. Big job. And what that gives you the understanding of is that it's just not neurons. It's astrocytes and other issues that are creating action potentials that create behavior, responsivity, glandular secretions, and motoric function. Oligodendrocytes. Isn't that a spectacular picture? Holy mackerel. You think nature's amazing until you think nature's amazing, you see something like this. So what are oligodendrocytes? They come from the Greek, meaning cells with few branches as compared to astrocytes, which have thousands. And each oligodendrocyte, which you see in the middle there, has a soma and has branches. And these branches create the myelin sheaths that go around the neurons that aid, they are insulators of these neurons. And what do insulators do? They allow the action potentials to move more efficiently through the neurons. So there's no loss of action potential due to dissipation. It's like an insulating wire. If our wires weren't insulated in our electrical stuff or things that we use, most of it would be dissipated into the environment where it's not insulated. Nature figured this out. She said, we're going to insulate these neurons so they will act very efficiently. And let me go see. And if you notice that there are little breaks in between the myelin sheath, and those are called nodes of Ravenir, the guy who dissected it out and described them. And these little nodes are flooded with calcium and potassium and sodium. And when an action potential has to go really quick, it skips even over the myelin sheath, goes right to the next node of Ravenir, and even moves the action potential even closer. But the underlying concept, one of the underlying concepts that I want to share with you, is that oligodendrocytes create myelin sheaths on neurons very early. So Roger said, and someone else said about ancestral issues or epigenetic issues, if as a formative child, being born, high cortisol levels, or just a neonate, the oligodendrocytes are going to myelinate those basal ganglia, which eventually lead into the thalamus, that produce the most effective survival model that we have. And when you talk about hardwired things, these oligodendrocytes and systemically, ancestrally, hardwire our neurons even before birth to allow us to have certain responsivity. That is ancestrally driven and also epigenetically driven and also experientially driven. So for example, if as a golfer, these oligodendrocytes activate myelin on some of my muscles, so my golf swing in my mind is repetitive in this. They're jumping the roads of Ravinier to allow my swing to happen on a simplistic basis. So the deeper thought here is that the oligodendrocytes really pre-stage our behavior by myelinating those things that improve our behavior. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but to go into that will just be, we'll go into a too deep a rabbit hole. Let's go to the next slide. Microglia. Now these are really interesting cells. These are the only cells in the brain that are derived from mesoderm, one of the three primordial tissues. And in this state that you see it now, it's in a resting state. It's just hanging out, floating through the interstitial tissues, looking for trouble. Looking for trouble. And if it finds trouble, if you look on your left, that is a resting microglia. And if it finds trouble, it pulls in its branches and eventually ends up looking like a big blob. This is an active microglia. And this microglia, these are called microcytes, they're hunting. They already have now experienced a pathogen, bacteria, some debris, and they all change into this form, and they then secrete materials. And one of the materials is something called reactive oxygen species. And this takes the bacteria and blows it up into shreds and pieces or dead cells and makes it readily available for the microglia to eat it. And it acts, therefore, as a macrophage, just as it does in our peripheral system, and eats the debris and eats the bacteria, and then does something very interesting. It then sends out little tags around its body. So imagine the active microglia having little points that come out that are called antigens. And these antigens attract lymphocytes. And the lymphocytes are like in the peripheral nervous system, like white blood cells. They come by and they sense this. And now they're capable of acting as antibodies to this antigen or this object that was there before that we needed to get rid of. And that causes a secondary inflammatory response, and it increases the amount of lymphocytes, and then hopefully removes all the debris or bacteria in the brain. And then the microglia goes back to a resting state. Whoops. Ependymal cells. These are such really, really, really cool cells. Now, if you look at this picture, the ependymal cells are listed right about 3/4 of the way through, and they're called ependymocytes. And if you look at them carefully, ependymal, they're really epithelial cells, and they line the spaces in which the cerebral spinal fluid exists. And if you look very closely, you'll see that they're cuboidal in nature and they're not closely packed. So they're leaky. So what the ependymal cell does is it monitors the interstitial fluid there, brings it through their spaces, and then helps create the cerebral spinal fluid that we use, which is another type of indicator for our flexible response mechanism. And these cilia help move the cerebral spinal fluid through our system. And that's why we know what's going on in our brain if we can tap into the cerebral spinal fluid and see what the ependymal cells are putting there. And another part or type of ependymal cells are called tanocytes. And they touch the blood vessels, they touch the astrocytes where those pink things are, they touch the neurons, and they basically keep in touch with the interstitial neurochemistry that allows the brain to function. So all of these things are happening all at the same time as the consciousness is then giving input into the flexible response mechanism. And all the 90% of the brain, which are not neurons, are then adding additional information to the neurons to give correct responses at one level of complexity. And I can tell you the rabbit hole is so deep, going there is just a headache. My head hurts. So I'm going to end here and just ask if there are any questions, anyone, in terms of how we understand just in the smallest possible way, how we understand how our consciousness then is flexible to our thalamus, which is then modulated by things like glial cells that will either potentiate action potentials, cause certain behaviors, and have flexibility of behavior to get the best possible outcome for survival. So let me see if I can close this now and get my picture up. I don't want to see my picture. So does anyone have any questions how this all comes together, or have I made it reasonably clear to everyone? And I'd like a little feedback on what you thought of it, because this is just part of the presentation and of the other brilliant presentations that are going to be given at the conference in June. So I open that up to anyone want to write. Doug, can you hear me?
Yes.
So if anyone wants to type in a question about how all of this works, I'll be more than happy to answer this for the next 15 or so minutes. And then if Doug wants to, I'm going to do a color havening after that for everybody, for the COVID. So any questions about any of this stuff? No, I guess I confused everybody thoroughly.
Well, fortunately, it's going to be on the video that we'll be able to watch many times, and hopefully it'll sink in eventually. It's very clear, just very clear, just a lot of information.
A lot of information. I don't expect people to understand it, but just get an idea that these things exist.
I want to say it was fabulous. Thank you so much. Really, really helpful. I got my notes, but I'm going to rewatch the video. Okay,
great. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I have to say that every lecture at the conference is going to be of my quality or better. Isn't this fun to learn this stuff?
Great.
Everybody's muted, but they're all nodding, so yes.
What is it? Non-conscious. Yes, Roger, that's exactly true. Roger wrote, well, you seem to be saying that our lives are non-conscious, and there's a lot more that goes into our brain activity than neurons. The neurons have been overblown. And what's interesting and why they were overblown is because of a stain that we were able to see them. And so the theories and the studies all became neuronal in nature. Okay. So I'm going to stop sharing screen. Anyone last questions? Okay. Stop sharing. How do I stop sharing, Doug?
There's
Press stop share.
That should do it.
Okay, do you see me now?
I do.
Okay. So I'm going to blow me up. I'm back on screen.
Yep.
So I hope that was interesting to everyone.
Speaking for the group, I think it was fascinating. And like I said, it's a lot of information. I thought it was very clearly presented. I'm sure that the re-watching the video will be very, very useful.
Right.
I will, by the way, put that up onto the Facebook group. And if you don't have access to the Facebook group, then you can email me, let me know, and I'll send it to you some other way. I don't know how specifically, but we'll figure it out.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. What I'd like to do, though, if I'm going, at least at this point, to, what I'd like to do now is,
You know what, Steve, before you do anything else, I'm just going to stop the recording so that'll it'll make the